This is Quent Bilo with the continuation discussion of process costing. This discussion will bring all 4 steps to bear on the preparation of production cost report. We've already talked about the first 2 steps, dealing with physical units and then translating those physical units into equivalent units of production. In this talk, we'll bring in steps 3 and 4 as well. Calculating unit production costs, average costs for both materials and conversion, and doing a cost reconciliation schedule, which is the last step of a production cost report. To summarize the 4 steps in a process costing, we dealt with output in physical units in step 1. We dealt with computing outputs in equivalent units in step 2. And now we're going to deal with summarizing total costs to account for and computing equivalent unit costs in step 3, and assigning total cost to units completed and units in ending inventory. Step 4 uses the unit costs and the equivalent units, both produced from step 3. Just a reminder, our 3 manufacturing cost elements: we keep materials separate from direct labor and overhead. Direct labor and overhead are combined into a conversion cost category. Material and conversion cost timings are different. This chapter assumes that all the material is present when production starts. However, conversion costs are added gradually as production progresses. That's why we'll calculate 2 unit costs, 1 for each cost grouping. A production cost report is a key document used to understand activities in process costing. It shows production quantity and cost data for each department, and we need to assign average costs as output leaves that department or is worked on by period end. Again, the 4 steps: compute physical flow. 2, compute equivalent units of production as if all the output were in fully produced units. Compute unit production costs in step 3, and finally, prepare a cost reconciliation schedule. That's an actionable assignment of costs to items transferred out and ending work in process at the end of a period. Here's an overview of the final product, a production cost report. Let's briefly highlight the 4 steps in its preparation. Step 1 ensures we know the total units to be accounted for, the B plus A in work in process department, the physical units. But our focus is on the ending status at month end. How many of those available units are completed and transferred out? 700,000 in this case. And how many units are not yet completed? 200,000 units. The units that remain in the ending June 30th work in process inventory. This ending status becomes our starting point for step 2. We translate the observable physical units into equivalent units. Output expressed in fully completed units, both done and not yet done, to obtain a common unit of measure to express total work performed during the period. Step 3 brings in all relevant costs in 2 categories: materials and conversion costs, and uses the equivalent units of step 2 to calculate unit costs for each category. Step 4 then uses those unit costs and the EU measurement of work performed to assign manufacturing costs to units transferred out and completed, and ending work in process units not fully completed. We need to ensure the assigned costs fully reconcile to the costs summarized in step 3. Production cost reports are assembled for each department or process that produces product. So for Eggo waffle production, there would be a separate production cost report for the mixing department, the baking department, and the packaging department. Each department produces an output used in the follow-on process before the product becomes a finished goods ready for sale. We'll focus on the mixing department only for illustration of the production cost report. Here's the data we'll need for the mixing department in order to complete a production cost report. We need to know the physical units we need to account for. 100,000 uncompleted and carried over from the prior month, and 800,000 new units started during the month. And we need to know the status of these 900,000 total units at month end. How many units are transferred out of the department? 700,000. And how many units are still left on the floor, not fully completed? 200,000. Those 200,000 remain in ending work in process inventory. The bottom part of this schedule brings in all the relevant costs we need to work with. We'll be using the weighted average method to complete the production cost report, which means we'll be merging or combining holdover costs of the prior period with current costs incurred during the month of June. We'll combine the material portion of the holdover costs from the prior month with the current material costs of June. Likewise for conversion costs, combining like category of costs. Step 1. Okay, let's recap what's happening in this step. We are dealing with physical units that can be observed. Total units to be accounted for. This is the B plus A, beginning work in process inventory for the month, plus additions of newly started units in the month, and determining their ending status at month end. Units completed, which are transferred out of the department, and therefore the dollars assigned will need to be subtracted from the work in process, and the ending E units, which are costed and remain behind. So step 1 determines what happened during the month. What do we have at month end in terms of the S and E statuses? That will be the starting point for step 2 in translating that total work into a common unit of measure, the EU, the equivalent unit. We'll take the 700,000 and 200,000 units and translate them into EUs for both of the cost categories, materials and conversion costs. And we'll use the end of month completion status for each of those categories, using the percent completed at month end to develop the equivalent unit as if it were fully completed for both materials and conversion. We do not need to deal with the completion status at the beginning of the period. In step 2, the mixing department fully processed 700,000 units. They are 100% done with respect to both the materials cost element and the conversion cost element. So we'll need to reflect the full amount of those units under each cost category. The ending June 30th work in process inventory is only 100% completed as concerns the introduction of the material cost element, but only 60% completed with respect to their conversion in the mixing department. This percent of completion with respect to conversion will be given to you. You'll need to make the EU calculation under the appropriate cost category. All the materials are there for costing of this element, but for conversion costing, the completed units are 120,000. The observed units of 200,000 times 60% complete gives us 120,000 EU calculation for conversion. From step 2, we'll come away with the measure of work performed for each cost category. 900,000 units that have all their materials in them, but only an EU calculation of 820,000 units that represent the full amount of units that would have been completely converted if all efforts were only spent on this status. Remember, this is a hypothetical calculation. We can't physically get our hands around all of the 820,000 units. But the fully completed unit, whether observed or calculated, is the common unit of measure we'll use in our next step to calculate unit costs. Why? Because we intend on using that same unit cost to assign to transferred out units and uncompleted units left behind at month end in ending work in process. Moving on to step 3, we go after our relevant costs to make these unit cost calculations, to express our cost in terms of EUs of production. When equivalent units of production are different for materials and for conversion costs, unit costs can be computed for the materials by itself and conversion costs by themselves. In this step, we will merge prior period material costs of unfinished units with current period material costs. And we will merge prior period unfinished conversion costs with current period conversion costs. Here's a recap of all the costs in the mixing department we saw earlier. The weighted average method will merge costs of incomplete units carried over from the previous period to current TMC, total manufacturing costs. Direct materials will be combined beginning in current. Conversion costs will be combined beginning in current. Here's the combined cost values we'll need to make our calculations in step 3. Simple combinations. Beginning direct materials costs are pulled out of last month's ending work in process value and adding in the new material costs incurred during the current period of $400,000. Our combined $450,000 of relevant material costs. And then the total material cost merged number divided by the EU calculation from step 2, 900,000 units, develops our unit cost for material costing purposes, or 50 cents for each equivalent unit. Ditto for conversion costs. Pulling out the conversion cost element from last month's ending work in process value, $35,000, and adding in new conversion costs incurred during the current period, $170,000, our combined $205,000 of relevant conversion costs. And then we'll use that total conversion cost merged number divided by the EU calculation from step 2, 820,000 units, to develop our unit cost for conversion costing purposes, or 25 cents for each EU unit. It's also useful to simply add together the material and conversion unit costs to obtain the total manufacturing cost per unit of 75 cents. Just to make it easier to assign costs to fully completed and transferred out units, completely done for both material and conversion costs. Once we have those respective unit costs, we'll use them for our fully completed units of 700,000 and the 200,000 units not fully completed at month end. We will cost out both of these S and E inventory statuses. The total costs were $655,000, prior period holdover dollars plus current costs associated to newly started units. The above numbers just need to be rearranged into materials only and conversion costs only to obtain the 50 cents and 25% respective unit costs. To complete the final step 4 of our production cost report, assigning costs to transferred out units and ending work in process units not yet complete. Using the total unit costs of 75 cents each times the 700,000 transferred out units to cost those at $525,000, costs that will move on to the next department. But when it comes to costing out the ending work in process, the different states of completion for that inventory are needed, which requires us to use 2 steps to cost out that ending incomplete inventory. The 50 cents per unit for materials only, giving a value of $100,000 for materials, and the 25 cents cost per unit for conversion cost only, giving a value of $30,000 for the conversion cost element. This step assigns costs to both the S and the E statuses of the work in process inventory of the current month. And the result is shown at the bottom of our production cost report. our final and fourth step of the process, where we see the previous assignment of calculation embedded here. To recap, step 1 deals with physical units only, arriving at the ending status of total available units during the period. How many were completed and transferred versus still in ending work in process. And using that as the starting point to calculate equivalent units for material and conversion categories, respectively. The second step is critical. Observed physical units times the percent complete for each category. Step 3 brings in total dollars to allow us to calculate unit cost for each cost category. Those total dollars come from the beginning work in process plus current costs associated to new units that were started. Importantly, those costs need to be combined along cost category lines, keeping material costs separate from conversion costs. $450,000 for materials and $205,000 for conversion costs. And bringing in the EU calculations for each category from the previous step 2, the 900,000 units for materials and the 820,000 units for conversion, to allow for the respective unit costs of 50 cents and 25 cents to be computed. These unit costs are then used to complete step 4, which is the actual assignment of costs to the ending statuses. The costs assigned to the respective inventory statuses must tie back or reconcile to the total cost we merged in the previous step. If that ties out, we've successfully completed the production cost report. Here's a review question. Largo Company had unit costs of $10 for materials and $30 for conversion costs. If there are 2,500 units in ending work in process, 40% complete as to conversion costs, but fully complete as to material costs, what's the cost assignable to the ending work in process inventory? This is the E value. $55,000. Let's look at that calculation. Remember, our unit cost calculations are based on completed units or equivalently completed. We had 2,500 physical units in ending work in process. All the material was there, 100%. So 2,500 EUs for materials cost at $10 per unit, $25,000. For conversion costs, of those 2,500 units, they were only 40% complete. That calculates to a 1,000 equivalent unit calculation. That 1,000 times $20 per conversion unit is $20,000. Total assigned to ending work in process inventory, $55,000. Another example. During March, Rodeo Manufacturing had the following unit production costs. Materials, $6. Conversion costs, $9 each. On March 1, the beginning of the month, it had 0 work in process. During the month, Rodeo transferred out 12,000 units. As of the end of the month, March 31st, it also had 800 units in ending work in process that were 25% complete with respect to conversion costs and 100% complete with respect to materials. Let's assign the cost to the units transferred out and the ending work in process inventory. Cost transferred out, 12,000 units times $15, the combination of the material cost of $6 and conversion cost of $9. $180,000 assigned to product moving to the next department. Work in process, end of the month. Materials, 800 observable units. All materials are there, $6 per material, $4,800. Conversion costs, 200 units times $9. Again, we have 800 observable units in ending work in process, but they're only 25% complete with respect to conversion. That calculates to 200 EU units times $9 for conversion cost, $1,800. Total cost assigned to transferred out units and the in-process, ending work in process, 186.6. In practice, companies often use a combination of process costing and job order costing. It's called operations costing. This hybrid system is similar to process costing in that it assumes that there's a standardized method to manufacture our products. But at the same time, the product may have customized individual features that require use of a job order cost system. For instance, all shoes may be sewed, glued, or assembled in the same process. However, there'll be different materials, leather, etc. That customizes the manufacturing process and uses job order to account for the materials. A hybrid system.